You never truly know a moment is the last, until it has already passed. On that quiet evening, nothing felt unusual. The streets were calm, the sky was dimming into night, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then went silent. It was the kind of ordinary moment the world forgets, instantly. But hours later, that same moment would be replayed again and again, dissected by investigators, whispered about by strangers, and remembered as the final chapter of a life that ended far too soon. The victim was known as someone who blended into the background of daily life. Not famous, not powerful, just familiar. A face neighbors recognized, a name co-workers spoke casually, a presence that felt permanent, simply because it had always been there. People like that rarely imagine they will become the center of a story that shocks the world. They assume tragedy happens elsewhere, to someone else. And that assumption is often the most dangerous thing of all. In the days leading up to the murder, nothing appeared out of place. Text messages were answered normally. Appointments were kept. Conversations ended with the promise of tomorrow. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Investigators would later describe it as a slow tightening, like a knot being pulled one thread at a time. No alarms were raised because there were no obvious reasons to raise them, and that silence allowed everything to unfold unnoticed. The last confirmed sighting happened shortly before sunset. A brief interaction, a smile, a nod, the kind of exchange that means nothing until it becomes everything. Cameras nearby captured fragments of movement, but no clear warning. A shadow crossing a frame, a figure pausing, then walking on. At the time it was meaningless footage. Later, it became evidence. When the body was discovered, the shock was immediate and overwhelming. The scene told a story of violence, but not chaos. There was no sign of a struggle spilling outward, no loud destruction. It was controlled, deliberate. That detail alone changed everything. This was not an accident. It was not random. Someone had arrived with intention, carried it out, and left behind a silence heavier than any scream. The reaction spread fast. News outlets scrambled for information. Social media filled the gaps with speculation. Strangers argued over theories they had no connection to, turning a real death into a puzzle to be solved for entertainment. Meanwhile, those who actually knew the victim were trapped in disbelief, struggling to understand how a life they had touched only hours before could be gone forever. Investigators moved quickly, but answers came slowly. The timeline was unclear. The motive was unknown. What stood out most was what was missing. There was no forced entry, no obvious theft, no clear message. Whatever happened was personal, but the reason remained hidden. That mystery would become the most haunting part of the case. As interviews began, patterns slowly emerged. Small details people had once dismissed now felt heavy with meaning. A conversation that ended abruptly. A disagreement no one thought was serious. A look that lingered too long. None of it proved anything on its own, but together, they painted the outline of a conflict no one had seen clearly while it was happening. Friends described the victim as careful, private, and routine-driven. Someone who didn't invite trouble and didn't share much about their inner world. That privacy, once seen as a strength, now worked against the investigation. There were thoughts and fears that had never been spoken, decisions that had never been explained, and now, there was no one left to clarify them. The location of the murder raised even more questions. It was familiar territory, not isolated, not dangerous by reputation, which meant whoever did this felt comfortable there, confident, possibly even familiar with the victim's movements. That realization narrowed the possibilities, but it also made the truth more disturbing. Late into the night, forensic teams worked under harsh lights, collecting fragments most people would never notice. Fibers, footprints, a partial impression that might have come from a shoe or might have been meaningless. Each piece was carefully catalogued, because when a case offers so little, even the smallest detail can become the key to everything. As hours turned into days, pressure mounted. The world demanded answers, but investigations don't move at the speed of public outrage. Rumors began to outpace facts. Innocent people were pulled into speculation, simply because they existed near the victim's life. And through it all, One question echoed louder than any other. Why? The autopsy revealed the final moments were brief but terrifying. There was no prolonged suffering, but there was awareness. The victim knew something was wrong. That knowledge, frozen in time, haunted those who read the report. It wasn't just the act itself that broke hearts, but the realization that fear had been the last emotion felt. Authorities announced they were looking closely at the victim's inner circle. That statement alone changed relationships overnight. Trust cracked. Conversations became guarded. People replayed their own interactions, wondering how close they had been to danger without knowing it. When a crime like this happens, it doesn't just end one life. It poisons many others with doubt. One piece of evidence stood out more than the rest, though investigators were careful not to reveal it publicly. Something that didn't belong. Something out of place. It suggested planning, not impulse. And if that interpretation was correct, it meant the murder wasn't the result of a single bad moment, but the final step of a decision made long before that night. As the case grew colder by the hour, one unsettling possibility began to take shape. What if the victim had sensed the danger but didn't understand it fully? What if the warning signs were there, subtle and easy to ignore, until it was too late? And somewhere out there, the person responsible was living normally, sleeping in their own bed, blending into crowds, watching the news, knowing the truth while the rest of the world searched desperately for it. Because the most frightening part of this story wasn't how it ended. It was the fact that it may have started much earlier than anyone realized. As investigators dug deeper, the case stopped being about what happened and started becoming about who had been overlooked. Phone records revealed repeated contact with one individual in the weeks before the murder. Nothing aggressive, nothing openly threatening, just a pattern that felt excessive. Calls made, late at night, messages sent and deleted, a presence that lingered without explanation. At first glance, it looked harmless. On closer inspection, it felt like someone watching from the shadows of everyday life. When questioned, that individual denied everything. Calm, cooperative, almost too composed. They spoke of concern, of friendship, of misunderstandings. Their words were carefully chosen, polished enough to sound sincere, but vague enough to reveal nothing. Detectives noted the behavior, but without direct proof. Suspicion alone meant nothing. The law demands certainty, not intuition. Meanwhile, the public narrative spiraled out of control. Online theories multiplied, each more dramatic than the last. The victim was transformed into a symbol, their life reduced to fragments that fit whatever story people wanted to believe. But behind the headlines, there were parents who couldn't sleep, friends who couldn't forgive themselves for missing signs that might not have existed at all. Then came the break no one expected. A single overlooked camera from a nearby location had captured a reflection, not a face, not a clear image, just movement at the exact time investigators believed the crime occurred. The footage was grainy, almost useless, but when enhanced and aligned with other data, it placed someone at the scene who had previously claimed they were miles away. Confronted with this contradiction, the calm began to crack. Stories shifted slightly. Timelines blurred. Small inconsistencies stacked up, like loose bricks, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a wall of doubt. The person insisted it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a failure of technology, but technology does not panic. People do. As pressure mounted, another truth surfaced. The relationship between the victim and the suspect was not what it seemed. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't rage. It was something quieter and more dangerous. Obsession. The kind that grows silently, feeding on imagined connections and unspoken expectations. The kind that turns ordinary interactions into perceived promises. Investigators reconstructed the final day. The messages exchanged. The routes taken. The moment paths crossed when they shouldn't have. And slowly a chilling picture emerged. The murder wasn't explosive or chaotic. It was the end of a fantasy colliding with reality, a realization that control had been lost, and with it restraint. During the final interrogation, the truth did not arrive all at once. It leaked out in fragments, long pauses, avoided eye contact, answers that circled instead of landing. And then, finally, a sentence that changed everything. Not a confession, just an admission of being there, of seeing the victim one last time, of feeling something snap. When the verdict was finally announced, it brought no relief. Justice in cases like this is a word people use because they don't know what else to say. A life sentence cannot restore a life. It cannot erase fear or undo the final moments. It only confirms what was already lost. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. No outbursts, no dramatic reactions, just quiet devastation on one side and hollow emptiness on the other. The person responsible stared forward, expressionless, as if the weight of their actions had finally crushed whatever illusion they once held. Outside, the world moved on. Traffic flowed. People laughed. New stories replaced old ones. But for those closest to the case, time had split into before and after. Every memory now carried an echo of how it ended. Every smile in old photos felt fragile, almost painful to look at. This murder shocked the world not because of how violent it was, but because of how human it was. There was no monster hiding in the dark. Just flawed decisions, ignored boundaries, and a failure to recognize danger when it didn't look dangerous at all. And that is the most heartbreaking truth of all. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it wears a face you recognize. The victim's story now exists as a warning, etched into public memory. Not about fear, but awareness. Not about paranoia, but boundaries. A reminder that silence can be as loud as a scream, and that listening to unease is not weakness, because the world didn't change the day this murder happened. Only the people who understood it did.